U.S. Navy versus China. On the morning of June 14, 2025, the USS Princeton had set out on its routine freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea. Everything seemed perfectly normal and the radar was showing only the usual shipping activity. But then, a faint beep echoed, and in that very second the atmosphere shifted completely as if this is the beginning of World War III. The USS Princeton's spy radar had locked onto some unusual movements nearly 200 kilometers away. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer, which had until then been idling in the waters, suddenly surged in speed from 18 knots to 30 knots in less than 90 seconds. To seasoned Navy veterans, this wasn't just a simple maneuver, it was a signal. Perhaps the Chinese were forgetting one thing. Challenging the US Navy in open waters is like playing with fire, because Princeton was not alone out there. In the same stretch of ocean sailed the mighty Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, the most powerful naval force America possesses. This 104,600-ton moving city, often described as floating American diplomacy, carried with it more than 90 of the most advanced aircraft in the world. At 9:26, USS Princeton's radar operators confirmed that the vessel ahead was indeed a Chinese Navy Type 052D destroyer. And then the US Navy did something that the Chinese could never have imagined, not even in their wildest dreams. So what exactly happened? And how did China ended up paying the price for challenging the US Navy? Let's find out. So by 9:29, inside the Combat Information Center of the Princeton, the atmosphere had turned serious into a war breakout situation. The captain asked, "What is the probable intent of the Chinese ship?" The operations officer replied, "Sir, at its current speed and heading, the destroyer will be within weapons release range in just 14 minutes. The protocol was clear that the ship should be placed on general quarters, the highest state of alert. But the captain of the Princeton decided otherwise. He wanted to see how far the Chinese were willing to go. At 9:30, the US Navy made its first decisive move. Princeton's systems automatically shared the entire threat data with every ship in the strike group. But at 9:35, the tactical picture shifted sharply from concerning to dangerous. From an altitude of 25,000 feet, an E-2D Hawkeye surveillance aircraft reported multiple aircraft launches detected from the Chinese carrier Shandong. Radar signatures soon confirmed it. These were Chinese J-15 fighters climbing aggressively southward. But the US air controllers noticed something strange. The J-15s were struggling to gain altitude. The reason was simple, it was all due to fuel limitation. And then just a minute later, 80 nautical miles away, sonar picked up a submerged contact. Its acoustic signature made it clear that it was a Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. But here's where things got interesting. Instead of operating silently, the submarine was making so much noise that it sounded like a freight train racing underwater. By 9:37, the flight deck of the US Nimitz had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. From the BFA-14 Top Hatters Squadron, F-18E Super Hornets were launching every 45 seconds from the catapults. This was the moment when US naval aviation began its power projection. The first division of Super Hornets climbed rapidly to 15,000 feet. With 1,100 transmit-receive modules, their APG-79 radars could track dozens of targets simultaneously. Meanwhile, the Chinese J-15s were relying on mechanically scanned radars, which revealed their positions easily. They were still struggling for altitude. Without a catapult system, they were forced to launch with reduced fuel and lighter weapons loads. On the other hand, the American fighters had taken off with extra fuel tanks and a full combat weapons load. If this turned into a long-endurance battle, the Chinese aircraft would start gasping for air the moment they left the runway. And that was only the visible disadvantage the one Chinese pilots could see with their own eyes. The real trump card of the US Navy was networking. Every F-18 was linked together through Link 16. That meant if one aircraft picked something up on its radar, the entire squadron was instantly updated with the same picture. On the other side, Chinese pilots were still depending on voice commands and their own individual sensors. And as soon as the Americans took their air game to the next level, the pressure on the Chinese pilots skyrocketed. The Americans unveiled their secret weapon, the EA-18G Growlers. These electronic warfare variants carried ALQ-99 jamming pods, capable of crippling enemy electronics from nearly 100 miles away. Once the Growlers established their jamming orbits, Chinese communications began collapsing. Their radar screens filled with coast contacts. At times they saw American fighters and then suddenly they disappeared. Sometimes they saw 4 and in the very next second, 14. Amid this chaos, the Americans executed a textbook tactical spread known as the wall formation. This defensive structure layered multiple altitudes, high cap at 35,000 feet, medium cap at 25,000 feet, and low cap at 15,000 feet. It created overlapping engagement zones and mutual support geometry, leaving the Chinese with no escape. No matter which direction they turned, they were stepping directly into someone's weapons envelope. On the other side, the Chinese formation was still flying a tight cluster. The reason was simple. Their data links could not support distributed operations. To coordinate, they had to maintain visual contact with each other. That very limitation made them predictable and dangerously vulnerable. At 9:43, an RC-135V rivet joint provided a crucial intelligence feed. It had been orbiting the skies for the last 6 hours, cataloging every single Chinese emission with its advanced electronic intelligence gear. Through this, the US Navy discovered something shocking. The Chinese pilots were actually seeking permission from Beijing before escalating. Then at 9:47, the Chinese destroyer's Type 346A phase array radar suddenly switched from search mode to full fire control level tracking, locking directly onto the USS Nimitz. In naval language, this is such a serious hostile act that most navies would retaliate instantly. But the Princeton kept its own fire control radars on standby. The captain knew that with 122 vertical launch cells at his command, he had enough firepower to erase the Chinese destroyer within seconds. At that moment, every firing solution on the USS Princeton was updating in real time the laser precision. The Chinese destroyer was now caught, step by step, in a web of threats coming from multiple systems and multiple angles. But then, the Chinese destroyer suddenly powered down its radar systems. The immediate surface threat seemed to fade, but the situation was far from over. Up in the skies, a J-15 pilot broke formation and lunged toward an American F-A-18, trying to intimidate it. The American pilot instantly read the move. In a smooth maneuver, he slipped behind the J-15's 6 o'clock position. All it would take was a squeeze of the trigger, and an AIM-9X Sidewinder would slam into the J-15's tailpipe, turning it into a ball of smoke. But the trigger was never pulled, because inside that cockpit sat not just a fighter pilot, but a living symbol of professional discipline. The Chinese still had one more desperate trick left. Beneath the waves, their Type 039 diesel-electric submarine was creeping closer to the Princeton. But at 9:51, it made the one mistake every submarine school teaches as a textbook blunder. It raised its snorkel to recharge batteries, creating noise. Inside Princeton's sonar room, operators must have almost smiled. That submarine had already been tracked for over an hour by the ship's SQ-Q-89 sonar suite. By 2:30 p.m., the US Nimitz unleashed everything it had. Every aircraft that could fly was launched into the skies. In one sweeping roar, 48 aircraft surged off the flight deck. F-A-18 Super Hornets carrying full combat loads. E-2B Hawkeys commanding the electronic high ground. And EA-18G Growlers armed with electronic warfare packages powerful enough to black out a city. The Growlers' ALQ-99 systems confused Chinese radars to such an extent that every sweep of their screens showed hundreds of phantom aircraft. The radar screens were so flooded with false targets that identifying real aircraft became nearly impossible. And then came the masterstroke that shattered Chinese morale. A Virginia-class attack submarine, which had been shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 straight days, suddenly surfaced at 3:47 p.m., just 6 nautical miles from the carrier Shandong. The distance was so close that Chinese lookouts could see it with their bare eyes. Think about it. For 8 days, that 7,900-ton American submarine had been moving right in their backyard, completely undetected. All of China's anti-submarine defenses, helicopters, sonombuoys, hull-mounted sonar had failed. The submarine rose from the sea like a massive whale. For nearly 90 seconds, it remained on the surface. Long enough for photographs to be taken, radio reports to be sent, and silence to grip the entire Chinese combat net. Then, and as calmly as it appeared, the submarine slipped back into the depths. The U.S. Navy's message was crystal clear that they owned the undersea domain. Meanwhile, in the skies above, American fighters began demonstrating textbook air combat maneuvers. The Chinese J-15s, already running low on fuel due to ski jump launches and heavy climbs, simply could not match the Americans' aggressive turns. Every engagement ended the same way. American fighters in firing position, Chinese fighters on the defensive, burning away what little fuel they had left. One by one, the J-15s were forced to return to the carrier Shandong on empty tanks. Pilots barely managed to land on emergency fuel reserves. And by 4:23 p.m., the Shandong carrier strike group began its withdrawal. Soon after, official Chinese communications announced that their scheduled exercises had been completed. But the truth was known to them as well. Challenging the US Navy had been the biggest mistake in their history. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to hit subscribe and stay tuned for more such stories that reveal the untold side of global power struggles. Thanks for watching, folks. I shall see you again in the next one.